Thanks for joining me in this reflection for the third week of Advent. A week when those who follow the tradition of lighting Advent candles are invited to reflect on the peace that is ours in Christ. Peace can be an elusive thing at the best of times, and it strikes me that it's a word that speaks to us on many levels. There might be moments when we all crave a bit of peace, a chance to break free of the pressures and expectations of others and just find some space to catch up with ourselves, so to speak. And even if we are able to find that outer peace, that personal space, we can still sometimes find ourselves inwardly troubled and our minds in turmoil and unable to find rest. In fact, sometimes we can be afraid of being on our own because the turmoil within us takes over. And of course, we might also talk about peace on a far broader scale, as we recognise that we live in a world where there always seems to be conflict and struggle between tribes and nations somewhere. We long for peace, yet peace can sometimes be quite elusive. And if we struggle to know peace, then that can only be exacerbated by a set of circumstances in which everything seems to have been turned on its head. Every aspect of our lives has been disrupted. And just about every nation in the world is currently caught up in the reality of that through a worldwide pandemic. So where does our peace come from? Yet there's so much that we might say in response to that. And perhaps, again, this is a moment to remember that Advent is not primarily some kind of countdown to Christmas, despite what the marketers of Advent calendars might want us to believe. It's a season in which we are invited to see our world differently and to calibrate our lives on the realities that we find in Jesus, Emmanuel, God with us, the Word become flesh. And if we want to talk about chaos and disruption, then we need to look no further than the events that we particularly associate with those descriptions of Jesus, coming into our world through the events of Bethlehem thousands of years ago. It would be so easy to simply look at those events at face value and argue that God seemed to bring far more disruption than peace. And at a human level, that's a quite reasonable and true assertion. But it strikes me that this is what Advent is all about. It's to recognise that there are times when all the disruption and turmoil that life throws our way just might be part and parcel of God's purposes being fulfilled. And whether or not that is the case in any given set of circumstances, the peace of knowing that God is present in all things and can be present in those situations and places that we might ordinarily not expect God to be present. And I sense that this is how people like Mary and Joseph found peace, not in their immediate circumstances, but by looking beyond them. And what I mean by that is not looking beyond them and just ignoring them or feeling that they couldn't acknowledge that they were happening, but by seeing the bigger picture that they represented. Their peace came from knowing that in everything they were facing, they were nonetheless held fast in the purposes of God. Their peace came from recognizing that whatever their immediate circumstances, God was accomplishing for the whole world, something that they themselves could never otherwise achieve. And as Jesus himself would later declare in his adult life, peace is a gift of God. Not something we have to somehow achieve for ourselves by overcoming our struggles and circumstances, but by seeking to discover God at their heart. Now, for Mary and Joseph and the infant Jesus, their experiences could not have been more lowly. Born possibly in a stable, but certainly as an outcast and laid in nothing more than an animal's feeding trough, running as refugees to shelter in Egypt while the rulers of their day unleashed a wave of brutal slaughter. But even in that, even in all of that, we can speak of God's peace prevailing. Now, the context in which the Old Testament Psalms were written could not have been more different to those lowly circumstances in which we learn of the birth of Jesus. The Psalms are a kind of royally commissioned book of hymns and poems, nationally recognised as the songbook of the people of God, and many of those who wrote them would have been all too familiar with the political power games and the military manoeuvrings that the monarchs and rulers of the day preoccupied themselves with. And Psalm 46 is one such psalm, probably written by royal commission for a state occasion. And it confronts many of the realities that I've described. All kinds of turmoils and tribulations, and as is often the case with poetic literature, it's sometimes hard to tell whether these are literal or symbolic phrases. But what's being described are mountains falling into the heart of the sea, and the waters foaming and roaring, and surrounding mountains then quaking, and desolation and war and victory and defeat. It's all in there. This is a psalm, again, that doesn't shy away from reality. And those who first engaged with these words would have been seen as the movers and shapers, the power brokers of their day. And perhaps that's why the psalm writer felt compelled to say the things that are contained here. Because in the midst of all of this human manoeuvring and scheming, the psalm speaks of the peace and security of knowing God. So let me invite you to hear some of its words. Psalm 46. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God, the holy place where the Most High dwells. Nations are in uproar, kingdoms fall. He lifts his voice, the earth melts. The Lord Almighty is with us. The God of Jacob is our fortress. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. Be still and know that I am God. Be still. There can be no more simple yet no more profound invitation to discover peace. And where does this peace come from? From making all these troubling realities stop? Well, the psalm doesn't really say. By coming out of all these conflicts and challenges as the winner? Well, as the psalm writer says, nations rise and kingdoms fall. That's hardly a picture of peace and stability on the world front. No. This is a peace that comes from knowing God. In the midst of everything else that is going on, from knowing God. And it strikes me that this is a phrase that could be writ large over every episode of the nativity story. Whether we're talking about an elderly childless couple who simply cannot believe that it's even possible for them to have a child, or a young woman not yet married suddenly discovering that she is to become a mother. Be still and know that I am God. Whether it's a convoy of people being forced against their will to take a journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem, or a troubled young man who is still deeply uncertain about the news that his fiancée is about to have a child. Be still and know that I am God. And when that young couple are rejected by their family and left outside of the lodging house, or when a group of terrified shepherds are suddenly confronted by an army of angels, the message is the same. Be still and know that I am God. Many of those circumstances remained unchanged. The stillness does not come from them all being sorted out or adjusted to better suit the preferences of those caught up with them, in them. The stillness, the peace, comes from knowing God, and knowing God amidst these human circumstances. Knowing that God can lift his voice and cause the earth to melt, but knowing that God can be no less real and no less at work by leaving this earth exactly as it is. And I sense that whether we look at the images of this psalm with its mountains falling into the sea and its nations in uproar, or whether we engage again in the disruption and turmoil that became the experience for the family of the infant Jesus, we can find within either realities that resonate with the disruption and the turmoil that we have all endured in recent months. And there is peace to be found, whether or not those things change or go away, or whether they remain. It is a peace to be found through the presence of God, summed up in those simple words: be still and know that I am God.